So it's been announced in the last about an hour or so. It's a breaking story. You can see it on the screen there, and that is WWE Hall of Famer Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff has passed away at the age of 71 years of age. It was announced by his son today on Instagram. WWE Hall of Famer Paul Orndorff has unfortunately passed away, as I mentioned, announced by his son in an Instagram post today. He was 71. This was the statement that his son posted on Instagram, quotes, "It is with great sadness that I announce the passing of my father, Paul Orndorff. He is better known as Mr. Wonderful, Paul Orndorff. Most of you will remember him for his physique. Many will remember his intensity. But if I could only get you to understand and see his heart, he will always be Pop, Paw, and Daddy at home. As much as many of you hated him as a wrestler, he absolutely loved you for it. He was an amazing father that showed me more love than I ever deserved. I love you, Daddy." Now, Travis Orndorff, his son, the same person who posted this statement, said that Paul had been dealing with dementia, which he believes was caused by chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. It's also known as a degenerative brain condition caused by repeated head trauma. A CTE scan and a CTE diagnosis can only be diagnosed posthumously, so that will be determined at a later date. But there recently had been a video. There recently had been a video going round of Paul Orndorff. It was actually posted by his son. I believe it was initially posted on YouTube. I think it then found its way to social media, and it showed Paul in, I believe, a care home or a care facility or an end-of-life care facility, something like that. And he was obviously in very, very, very rough shape. He was obviously dealing with, again, dementia and a degenerative brain issue at the time. It was very clear that, and it was very sad, and it was very upsetting. And there was this discussion at the time about, should that stuff be on social media? And lots of people were sharing it, and there was a discussion of, you shouldn't be sharing that kind of stuff. Let the man have his dignity. Let the guy come to the end of his life in a peaceful and respectful manner. And again, that was only posted. I mean, I remember seeing that only a couple of weeks ago. So it just goes to show. And the thing is, nowadays, some fans, more modern fans of pro wrestling, might not be familiar with Paul Orndorff, might not be familiar with Mr. Wonderful, but when I say that in WWE's golden generation, in their golden generation of the 1980s, you struggled to find a bigger heel than Paul Orndorff. I mean, it was Roddy Piper, it was Paul Orndorff. That's the WrestleMania 1 main event, right? It's Hulk Hogan, it's Mr. T, it's Roddy Piper, it's Paul Orndorff, Pat Patterson, special guest referee, because Muhammad Ali's the enforcer / referee. I mean, people talk about, when they talk about WrestleMania 1, they'll talk about Hogan and they'll talk about Piper, but they kind of forget, and they'll talk about Mr. T, and you kind of forget Paul Orndorff and all of that. And he was so important, when Vince McMahon was taking the WWE national in the 1980s, Hulk Hogan needed a foe. And yes, you had Roddy Piper, but before that you had Paul Orndorff. He was one of Hogan's staunchest rivals. And Hogan for years knew that this was a guy that he could make money with. That's why when Hogan went over to WCW in the mid-90s, when the beginning of Monday Nitro, it's actually funny because I've only recently started to rewatch those early episodes of Nitro on the network, and Paul Orndorff's featured in. There's that, and I say it with a smile on my face because it was so bad. But I look back on that infamous segment at Full Brawl, I believe it was, with the Gary Spivey segment and the psychic, Gary Spivey of the Psychic Companions Network. It's such a bad segment, but you look back on it with fond memories after a while, and this was a guy that even then, this just shows the commitment that Paul Orndorff had to pro wrestling and he had to his fans. I mean, his son mentions it in that statement. This was a guy, primarily, the majority of his career, he's a heel. He's getting heat from the audience and all that kind of stuff. But this is a guy that, he had a serious neck injury. And because of a serious neck injury, his arm, I believe his left arm, you can Google it, had atrophied so much that you can't really see it in the photo here on the screen, but his arm had atrophied so much that it kind of had shrunk down, and he essentially was working as a one-armed wrestler, and he didn't need to do that. He didn't need to do that at this point, but he was doing it for the fans. He was doing it for the fans, and he was doing it for his love of pro wrestling. I'm sure money was a part of it, but this is a guy that he did everything for the fans. And I remember, again, looking at seeing that clip on social media a few weeks ago. I recall because that was his son's YouTube channel. I think there's only a couple of videos on there, and they're all just about providing health updates about Paul Orndorff. And obviously the last one is the one that got a lot of people talking. But the one prior to that, I think they set up a GoFundMe for something, and there is a GoFundMe set up for medical costs and funeral expenses as well. We'll put a link in the description box for that as well if you feel you want to contribute. But if you go back on that YouTube channel and you see the past video that his son had posted of him, he's sitting there. I think he's in a chair, and he's sitting on his porch, and he's very thankful to the fans till right up until the end. He's very thankful for the fans, and he said, "Look, I would do it all over again in a heartbeat. You're the reason I did it. Your support means everything for me, and I would do it again, and I would do it today if I could, because I love the fans that much." And that, to me, just speaks absolute volumes in an industry where people can be so bitter, and they can be so downtrodden and angry or upset or unhappy about the pro wrestling industry. Paul Orndorff just wasn't that. He just wasn't that. He loved the business, and that really says it all. Now, Orndorff, as I mentioned, was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in the class of 2005. He was inducted into the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame in Wichita Falls, Texas in 2009. In 1986, as I mentioned, right at the beginning and right at the heart of WWE's golden era, the golden generation, whatever you want to call it, the birth of Hulkamania, and really when WWE was being taken national and taken into the stratosphere with the Rock and Wrestling Connection, all that kind of stuff. In 1986, his feud with Hulk Hogan was voted as Feud of the Year by both Pro Wrestling Illustrated and the Wrestling Observer newsletter. And the tributes have been pouring in. And if you haven't seen it before on the channel, what I'll do is I'll put together a tribute video talking about all of these touching tributes, these really touching tributes that we've seen for Mr. Wonderful today. And it really is a look. Whenever any pro wrestler passes away, it's an incredibly sad story. Again, because we'd seen like a couple of weeks ago, again, that video, it hasn't, I suppose, totally taken us by surprise. But look, this was a guy that, he'll be remembered in history for being in that main event of the first ever WrestleMania. You won't be able to ever take that away from him or his family or anything like that, or his career. And whilst he was known for that impressive physique, he was also a damn good wrestler as well, hitting the pile driver. And again, that first WrestleMania main event, 1985, Madison Square Garden, Paul Orndorff, Roddy Piper versus Hulk Hogan and Mr. T. And it's such a shame, because I remember, and I'm sure we'll be able to find it. I'm sure if you Google it, they did basically a callback to it, to WrestleMania 30 in New Orleans. They did a callback to it. There was a backstage segment where it was Mr. T, Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, Paul Orndorff, and they had Pat Patterson in the middle there, and it was the main event. It was the main event of the first ever WrestleMania 30 years later. And now, Piper's gone, Orndorff's gone, Patterson's gone, and it's so sad. It really is so sad. And also, as well, again, what I think people won't recall about Paul Orndorff is that he was an accomplished American football player as well. He was a running back at the University of Tampa, was taken in the 12th round of the 1973 NFL draft by the New Orleans Saints. Never played in the NFL, but the fact he was able to be drafted was significant. Got into pro wrestling in 1976. Competed in various NWA territories, won the NWA Southern Heavyweight Championship from Jerry the King Lawler. Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, he worked, as I mentioned, various NWA territories, had great matches against the likes of Jake the Snake Roberts, Ted DiBiase, the American Dream Dusty Rhodes. Officially joined the WWE, the World Wrestling Federation as it was known then, in 1983. Quickly ascended up the card and formed an alliance with Hulk Hogan, and then had an infamous heel turn in the summer of 1986, which of course led to that, fantastic rivalry. As I mentioned, you had Hulk Hogan, you needed the villain. And that's what Paul Orndorff was. They had the match, which was Hogan and Orndorff, was at the big event in Toronto, drew over 60,000 fans. As I mentioned, during that feud, that's when Orndorff suffered the injury, forced him into retirement by 1988. But he came back. He came back, joined WCW in the 90s. There are just great stories and some infamous stories with the Vader shoot fight and flip flops and all that kind of stuff. And as I mentioned, I recall that again because he was in WCW in the mid-90s. Again, because of this issue with his right, I believe it was his right-hand side. It was the neck injury, the arm injury because of the atrophy in his arm. I believe he carried on working for WCW right up until the end of the 90s, I think he was an agent and a trainer as well for WCW. I might be wrong there. I believe he as well. If I recall correctly, and I might be wrong here, but I recall him becoming an on-screen character briefly in '99 as well, and this is during Russo's era. But look, unquestionably a top-tier Hall of Famer, arguably one of the greatest heels never to be a world champion in WCW or WWE. I think if it wasn't the beginning of Hulkamania, if it wasn't the beginning of Hulk Hogan, who knows what he would have achieved. But you have to remember, all of that eruption that was Hulkamania and Hulk Hogan, it has to be spurred on by a heel. And you had Roddy Piper and you had Paul Orndorff. So it's a really sad story. It's a real sad story. And as I mentioned, we'll do a tribute video here on the channel. But it's a horrible story. It truly is. And it's another great pro wrestler that's left us. So Mr. Wonderful, Paul Orndorff, rest in peace. You'll be sorely missed.
Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.